Kumbamalkan, Kumbanani Gyanadu, which is good evening. It's good to see you in Barragum, which is the language of the community that I grew up on the Darling Downs. Good evening, everyone, and it's fantastic to see you here this evening. I'm Vicky McDonald, and I'm State Librarian and CEO here at the State Library of Queensland. And on behalf of my colleagues, I welcome you to State Library of Queensland for the second in our Portrait of an Artist series of events for 2021. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. State Library is located on Kirilpa Point, which is a traditional meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people, and we proudly continue that tradition today and every day of the year. It's also appropriate that tonight, during NAIDOC Week, a week that celebrates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history and culture and the achievements of First Nations people, that we come together to celebrate the work of a prominent Australian artist. I'd like to acknowledge and welcome tonight's very special guest, Vernon Ah Kee. I also welcome tonight's conversation facilitator, Angela Goddard, Director of Griffith University Art Museum. I also welcome and extend our sincere gratitude to James C. Sourris AM and Marika Sourris for their vision and enthusiasm in working with State Library to create and collect artist interviews. I also welcome councillors of the Queensland Library Foundation, colleagues from across the Cultural Centre, ladies and gentlemen, and of course everyone who's watching our live broadcast this evening. It's fantastic to have such a strong crowd this evening, despite COVID, and particularly during NAIDOC Week for this evening's event. Tonight, we welcome our very first James C. Sourris AM collection artist back to State Library. And it's wonderful to be able to do so in NAIDOC Week, a time to celebrate the history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this nation. Vernon Ah Kee was born in Innisfail, far north Queensland, and in 1967, and is of the Kuku Yalandji, the Waanji, Yidinji, Koko, Berrin and the Gugu Yimithirr descent. Sorry. He moved to Brisbane in 1996 to study visual arts at Griffith University, undertaking the groundbreaking Bachelor of Contemporary Australian Indigenous Art course at the Queensland College of Art. Vernon was a key scholar, graduating from Griffith with a Doctor of Visual Arts, Fine Arts in 2007. As an active member of Brisbane's First Nations art scene, he co-founded the legendary and still active collective proppaNow with fellow artists Richard Bell and Jennifer Hurd in 2004. Over the last 2 decades, Vernon has presided over a stellar career that has received global attention. He has represented Australia at the Venice Biennale, and his work has been included in significant national and international exhibitions and is sought after by major public institutions and private collectors. State Library has had a long and proud association with this distinguished Queensland artist. His work featured in our 2012 exhibition, It's Gotta Be Proper, documenting proppaNow's history. The same year, his moving portraits of family members were heavily featured in the major exhibition, Transforming Tyndale, that explored the legacy of anthropologist Norman Tyndale. In 2010, Vernon was the first artist to be interviewed for the James C. Sourris Artist Interview Series. His work is also currently on display in our Deadly Threads showcase, which you can see in Kurildargan on level 1. We are certainly extremely fortunate to have Vernon join us this evening. Tonight's facilitator, Angela Goddard, has also had a distinguished career in the visual arts. She curated major exhibitions at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art in her role as curator of Australian art. Now, as Director of Griffith University Art Museum, she works at the cutting edge of Queensland, Australian and international art. I'm very pleased to welcome Angela to the State Library this evening. I encourage everyone to participate in the conversation tonight by sending your questions via Menti for the Q&A session at the end of tonight's talk. Details will pop up on the screen throughout tonight's conversation. I hope you enjoy the evening, and I look forward to welcoming you back to State Library for our next Portrait of an Artist event on the 13th of October. And that event will focus on the life and work of the wonderful Dr. Benita Eli, whose interests in feminism, environmental and socio-political issues will make for an equally lively discussion. I'd also encourage you to visit our Deadly Threads showcase and our recently opened Entwined People and Plants exhibition, which is in the SLQ gallery on this level. There's plenty to inspire you here at State Library of Queensland. We will now play Vernon's digital story from the Portrait of an Artist series, and following the story, we'll have Vernon in conversation with Angela. So enjoy the evening and thank you for coming. Thank you.
I make work about my life and the kind of issues and events that inform my life. They inform my thinking. And I think of myself as coming from a family. I don't think of myself as being out on my own and or as an individual at all, really. I think my family is just a normal family, just an ordinary family with heroes and villains. And I thought that if my family is like this, then every family is. And that's the idea that I wanted to project, stripping away the primitive and the exotic from the image of the contemporary Aboriginal. So I wanted to give this idea of the black people that I know is true. I know it's true of myself and my immediate family and my extended family. It had always been about making art about my life experience and my family and what happens to Aboriginal people, what actually happens to Aboriginal people and what Aboriginal people do and how they think and what they say. And that's what I wanted to do. I mean, it didn't make any sense to make art about, you know, a time or an imagined time in Aboriginal history that, you know, may or may not have been real. I have very early memories of drawing. I don't remember the first time, but I do have a sense of drawing when I was very little. I have a sense of sitting down on the floor in my Nana's house, in a corner under the table, and just drawing on I don't know, anything, paper, and but my mum and my grandmother tell me that I was drawing really, really little, and they would just give me something. But then again, all kids draw when they're very little. You can give any kid a pen and paper and they will draw. But I have a sense of that when I was very little, like 3 or 4, 5 years old, and things like that. But the difference with me though is that as I got older, I became more obsessed with it. None of us are born being able to draw well, but we are born loving it, and that's all it takes really. And you discipline yourself, but it's racking up the hours. And I really appreciate the obsessive way I went about it now. You know, like, you know, I used to go looking in bookshops for any drawing books, any technical kind of processes that I could discover, because I didn't really have teachers that could point me in those directions. I never had a teacher at school who said, here, this is a book about drawing. 2004, 2005 was somewhere around there. Richard and I were just sitting down talking, and Richard, as he does, he just gets up and he just says, you know, oh, that's it, you know, we should start up our own group. And he said, yeah, we need a name, we should. And I said, yeah, you know, this has to be a proper group, you know, it's got to be a proper group, proppaNow, you know. And he said, well, that's what we should call it then. And we want it to be, you know, an engine that produces that kind of voice, you know, that sustains that kind of work. So, and I'm aware that it's up to us to actually lay the groundwork for that, to produce a body of work as individuals and as a group identity. Because there's a lack of critique outside of proppaNow, we have to be responsible enough to take on that role within proppaNow for each other. It's a good way of regulating the quality of what we do. In North Queensland, it was made very, very clear to me very early on that I was Aboriginal and that I was not going to be considered or permitted to be anything other than that. And so I don't know when I kind of took that and ran with it. And I like it. Certainly me and my cousins that I grew up with, we liked being blackfellas. We all still like being blackfellas. And it doesn't occur to any of us that we want to be anything else. And so in terms of how that informed my art practice, I would say that it informed my art practice fully. And so if people want to call me an Australian artist, then that's fine. But an Aboriginal artist is probably more apt. It more fully describes me.
Good evening, everyone. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting this evening, the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here this evening. I live here in Turrbal country, but was born in Dja Dja Wurrung country and spent some time also growing up in Kombumerri country as well.
And Angela and I, we spoke about a welcome to country, and oftentimes we've all seen it treated as like a throwaway thing, but people don't realise that it actually carries a lot of weight if you take it seriously and treat it properly. And a welcome to country, you're supposed to say who you are. You're supposed to show who you are by how you present yourself and how you introduce yourself. And so I am Bama. I'm a rainforest blackfella. I'm from North Queensland, and Bama is a rainforest catch-all term to describe rainforest people, and the word itself means person. And so when you kind of announce yourself, you're announcing that you're a person. And if you go to North Queensland, you have to show who you are. You have to show that you're also a person. Because when you turn up and you're not Bama, then you're not a person. And so you have to show who you are, and that's what Welcome to Country is supposed to do. So with that, I want to acknowledge the Aboriginal communities of Brisbane and Greater Brisbane and the southeast here. And I am very, very honoured to be able to kind of be here and make my career and my practice here with good friends and family. And I also want to acknowledge my mother-in-law here. And there are several important people, friends and family here, and I thank you all for being here.
Well, thanks so much, Vernon. It's amazing watching that video because it's over 10 years old now.
It's 10 years old. And I don't know, James, did it sound like I was talking a little bit too quickly there? Seemed like the video was running a little bit too fast. But I'll try to slow down, I suppose.
I think you'll be all right. I think we all understood.
But 10 years ago, that's quite an adventure for all of us, I think.
Yeah. And you were interviewed for that video by the wonderful Daniel Browning, and we didn't get to hear his golden tones, in that little snippet. But,
dulcet tones.
Yeah, beautiful interviewer, and the extended interview is very incredibly revealing and interesting. And but when you look at that video now and reflect on your career 2010, so much has happened since then. What do you think about when you just look at yourself at that time?
Well, my hair is a bit darker, and but sometimes I think I watched that interview again before just last week, and I was thinking, gee whiz, that's some pretty heavy stuff there. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Like it. I don't know if it caught James Sourris off guard when he first watched it himself, thinking, "Oh, well, what have we got myself into here?" But but I just thought, and I still think that you stick to your guns, say what you need to say when it needs to be said. I think, and I think I've been consistent. And that's kind of what I get from that. I'm quite pleased that I have been. At least I've tried to be,
Well, absolutely. I was thinking about and preparing for this talk and thinking about the first work of yours that I saw, Vernon, which was, nearly 10 years earlier than the interview. It was upstairs at the old Bellis Gallery in the Valley, and in 2002. And that work was called If I Was White, and it had been started a couple of years before then. And this was just a series of very simple A4-inch inkjet prints. It's pinned to those walls, I think I remember, and in a way of quite a humble work. But it was hard-hitting, as you say, and each text began with the sentence, "If I was white," and then I think one of the images here shows an excerpt from that work, and includes phrases like, "I would be more likely to live longer. I would have nothing to fear from police," and just think of all the names I wouldn't have been called. This absolutely confronted me as a non-Indigenous person, and these statements and frames of reference, and walking around the room, it's kind of a relentless almost experience. But I think that you had made that work just out of art school. Like, already you had found a language and a position from which to speak and to confront. Do you believe that happened to you during art school or earlier? When did that kind of position emerge for you?
Yeah, that was when I was doing. It's when I was, kind of reading a lot about critical race theory, and as you do back then, and looking at whiteness studies and kind of wanting to rant, but not knowing how to go about it in a good way or even an effective way, and knowing that I needed to kind of build a language, and not just a kind of written language, but also a design language, and to have some structure to the way I went about making actual artwork, and that was the beginnings of when I was in postgrad, yeah, and I think just kind of realising that I needed to kind of start putting together building blocks that I could kind of grab at any time and form them into different shapes when I need them. And that was certainly the beginnings of it, I think. Stopped me ranting so much, certainly. Although, if I was white, what's particular about it is the background. It looks grey, but it's actually a 4,000-word rant about, very much in the kind of throes of critical race theory studies and whiteness kind of vernacular, I guess. Yeah.
And another early work from around this period is This Man Is, This Woman Is, maybe even the next series of work from If I Was White.
Yeah, that was in that same postgrad show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is where we see, I think, the conjunction of image and text.
And portraiture.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. One of those images is of you yourself,
Yeah, and the other one is of Belinda Miller, who was a fellow student at the time, and I just said, you know, do you want to do this artwork? You know, do you want to be in this artwork? And I just asked for a favour, because that work originally, I was going to be all of the characters, so the male characters and the female characters, and the characters are male or female, but they're all Aboriginal in varying ages, and some of them are, you know, from my own family history, and some of them are just from research, historical texts, and but I was originally going to do other minority peoples as well, and I was going to be all of them. So, you know, immigrants and refugees and Asians and, you know, what have you. But I thank goodness I didn't. I would have. I still often think of that. You know, particularly in the case of refugee populations, I think that Aborigines, we should be the chief advocates for refugees in this country, but it's a lot to take on all of those characters, let alone those identities, and to speak effectively and constructively. So yeah.
Whereas, and that comes later too, perhaps.
It does, yeah. Gradually. Yeah.
But in each of these panels, there's an image of it's almost like a mugshot of yourself and
we're photographed against a brick wall as well, and it's and it's meant to be a very neutral kind of again referencing archival images like the Tyndale images. So yeah.
And underneath each of those is a brief text or a life story from throughout history.
Yeah, like a one sentence bio kind of thing. Yeah.
But perhaps this is also, I think, in your practice that we first see your use or your deployment of the gaze as well. Would you say? Yeah. So this looking back upon the viewer, and in those images, it's very, very direct. And thinking about the we see in the video the vision of you drawing and making these very large scale portraits. Perhaps you could talk about how you have worked with the gaze within your portraiture.
Yeah, I think portraits, they are most effective when a gaze can be locked onto by the viewer, and I think, you know, if you go to any kind of gallery or museum where they have like historical portraits and that, we unconsciously try, when we look at any image of a group of people, we're all trying to lock on to somebody whose gaze is looking back, and when we don't see it, we move on. We all do it. Yeah, and I think that kind of energy, when we can sense that an image is active in that way, is amazingly attractive. But you know, it's up to me as the artist to kind of ascribe meaning to that gaze and context to it as well. So, and that's what's happening in all the portraits, and in the gaze, it has to be what I say it is, and you have to feel it the way that I say you should, and you know, and because I am kind of wanting the portrait to be something besides me, and it has to kind of stand there and operate on its own. You know, the idea that I can remember when I was doing a bunch of them in the studio, and I had about 4 of them around me, and I remember sitting in the dark, and the light was still, you could still see them, and they're huge, and but it was all my family, so I was cool with it. But you had these big faces just peering in at me, and I was okay with it, but I imagined that somebody else sitting there, and not me, you would feel this kind of gaze, and that's this kind of energy that portraiture is always striving for, I think, and particularly portraiture works of scale, I think.
So your first drawing show wasn't until a couple of years later, 2003, 2004. And these were works of a kind of, decent sized drawings. But then there's this point in which you just explode the scale of the drawing. Did you first do that with the Tyndale images in the first instance?
I remember I wanted to, one of the very first drawings is, I wanted the very first ones to be technically very good, and I suppose you could say technically a little tighter than they are now. But one of the first ones was my grandfather, Mick Miller, and who was, he was just a larger-than-life character, and I remember that, and I'd done a couple of portraits of him on paper, and but I think I had always intended doing him big, because he was just big to us, to me and my cousins. His personality was always writ large, and he was kind of, one of my cousins is here, and he was kind of like that. He was never switched off, and oftentimes my cousins and I, when we're in North Queensland, we'll sit around talking about him, and we all know exactly how we feel about him. And so when I did that portrait, I always just think, it's got to be big. And my other grandfather, my dad's father, Eddie Ah Kee, he was the opposite. He was a quiet fella, but he meant a lot to me, and I wanted to, I suppose I wanted to monumentalise both of the grandfathers. Yeah, but with Mick Miller, of course, and I think anyone who knew him would readily say, if you're going to do a portrait of him, it's got to be at some scale, Yeah, he was a character. Yeah. And I don't even think we knew even half of his life. Yeah, he was something else again. Yeah, he was a Waanji man. Yeah.
But the Tyndale photographs, Tyndale documented members of your family a generation or two before Mick's generation.
Well, the first time I started doing drawings from the Tyndale collection, so this is my grandfather, Mick Miller, but the very first drawing I did of him at scale was of an image of him when he was much older, and very much the grandfather that we all grew up with. And whereas that's an image of him as a young man who we never knew. So that was so it was a curious thing to have access. And I remember when I first moved to Brisbane, that was in the early 90s, was when the Tyndale archive was opened up to all the libraries, and that was in the very early 90s. And so one of the first things I did when I came to Brisbane was I came to the State Library here, and just basically said, I wonder if I can access images of my family from Palm Island. And they chased them up, and the images that they got back were very rudimentary, not very detailed images. And so I did a drawing, I reproduced them as a drawing, trying to find out who these people were, trying to find out more information. And then some years later, I was in Adelaide, and I went to the archive, and I got better copies of these images, and they were full of detail. And particularly on our great-grandmother, Annie Arsem's dress, we had all grown up, my cousins and I had all grown up, thinking her dress was a white dress. And then when I got these images back, it's a white dress with a pattern on it. Looks like a bird or something on the dress itself. And I said to my cousin, "Did you know this? Have you seen this before?" And no one had. And I just said, "Oh, you know, you got to see this." And but that when I had those source images again with all that extra data, I knew exactly what I was going to do with them, and I was going to produce them really big, and tease out any information I could find out about them. And I wanted to know, you know, because when you're a portrait artist and you're doing portraits of people's faces, you are unavoidably knowing them. You are unavoidably wanting to find out more. You develop this curiosity within yourself about your subject, and you want to. But particularly those kinds of images, I wondered what my great grandmother's skin was like. Yeah, because it seemed so present, and the light in the image seemed to bring them to life, and you know, and so I mean, a photographer would look at those and just think, wow, this is more alive. This person is not the same as the ones in those original images. But so it was like that, and it was an opportunity for me to find out more about these people. And so, you know, spending more time on the actual facial features and the skin and the wrinkles and the hair and the eyes, and to see what was there, and in the shape of the mouth and the jawline and everything, and kind of greedy for it. I was, you know, knowing that for the time that I was drawing it. It was kind of like having absolutely exclusive access to new information about this person that I was kind of chipping away at myself, and then you know, taking photos of it and documenting it and saying, you know, have you seen this? I can't wait to show this to my family. You know.
Despite the conditions in which these images were collected.
Oh, the context of them, yeah.
Yeah, but you keep these images so close to you, Vernon, and when we met a few weeks ago, you were able to pull up those photographs on your phone like quicker than I can pull up an image of my son. You know, I mean, you've got them; they're handy. You know, you've got them with you all the time. And you also mentioned that your grandmother carried them around in her purse.
That was how we knew about them, and I think my Auntie Betty was the one who went down to. And I think Auntie Betty got them for my nana, and I'm not sure where she got them from, but I think she must have gone down to Adelaide and got them. But my grandmother had these little tiny little kind of pictures in her purse that she carried around with her all the time, and we all knew what these images were, and and so when I came down to Brisbane in the early 90s, I accessed these images through the library here. I thought they were amazing. The only thing was, the only kind of really disappointing aspect of that whole journey of discovery for me was when I went down to Adelaide and found out that the images that were available here had been cropped into mugshots like you see in police stations. And I thought, oh my God. So my grandmother had been carrying these images around, not knowing that full figure images existed. And I just thought, you know, bugger. So that was the only kind of downside to that whole journey of, you know, kind of revealing to myself who these people were. But you know, like in George Sibley, my great grandfather, you know, it was so exciting seeing the weave in his shirt and realising that he had a tobacco pouch in his pocket, and looking at the haircut that he had and his hair, and getting a sense of his hair and skin and stuff, and none of that was in these little pictures that my grandmother had. So it was kind of like there was a period of a few years there was like revelation after revelation, and to me it was very exciting because it was all this data, and literally scientific data that I knew that through my work with these images I was going to make them people. You know, not just humans, but real people.
Mm. And I think that Transforming Tyndale exhibition captured very much that sense of push and pull with these images. That there is the
Yeah, the whole exhibition was doing that at every turn. You know, but Michael Aird and I, who worked together on that show, we kind of, well, I suppose me more than Michael, we just said that, you know, this is an exhibition about families, and it's about Queensland families, and it has a Brisbane focus. That's how important the show is. And I want people to know that this is not about Norman Tyndale or even the Adelaide Archive. This is about Queensland families, and families that are here in Brisbane still.
But I think also in terms of your methodology of that push and pull, the attraction, and then I was thinking, and you mentioned this the other day, that your crosshatching technique that you use when you're making these enormous drawings, you also use that technique when you're working on the riot shields that were displayed just recently at the University of Queensland Art Museum.
Yeah. I mean, for me, when I was developing that kind of, you know, that's kind of crossing technique with charcoal, I actually thought about it like, and I was rendering skin, and I thought that it was like cuts, like cutting like that, like sword strikes or something like that, and I still think that. And so when I wanted to do something about the 2004 Palm Island and police in Queensland, I started drawing in charcoal on riot shields, and using the same drawing action to cover these shields in, and it was the same thing, you know, like cutting into the skin. But I've said before, it's like you know, thousands and thousands of little cuts every day, but not enough to kill you, but to hurt you every time. You know, you wake up and spend your whole day being cut like that, and then, you know, sleep on it, walk it off. Yeah.
I think that I want to also reflect that since the interview, since 2010, you know, your work has shifted in a few different directions. I think that same year, later that same year, you produced Tall Man in 2010, which was the 4-screen video installation that documents the crisis that happened in 2004 on Palm Island. And this footage was sourced from mobile phones, handheld camera, security film, television newsreels and things like that.
Yeah, it was the evidence that was used against, video evidence used against Lex Wotton, used against him in his trial.
You'd already made a video work a couple of years earlier, but this really launches you into working much more within that medium of video.
Yeah, I think I'd kind of... Cant Chant was in 2007, and and then I think Waru was the same year, was 2010, and Cant Chant was about surfing, and but Waru was about cricket and growing up in North Queensland, and that was kind of like I'd wanted a project that could directly involve my family and be something in Innisfail, you know.
And maybe also involve cricket.
And cricket, yeah, and because we grew up playing cricket.
We know how much you love cricket.
Yeah. Well, I'm not alone, but so there was that, and but Toolman came about because I had been given the footage, just handed all the footage, and thinking that the person gave me the footage just handed it to me, thinking that I would do something with it. And I sat on it for a few years, and I knew that I wasn't going to do anything while Lex was locked up. And then when Lex was paroled, I went up to Palm Island to see him, because he's married to my cousin. And I went up to see him, and basically we were just in his kitchen having a cup of tea, and he goes, "Oh, well, what did you want to talk about?" And I'd already spoken to him on the phone before I went up there, but we just said, and I just said, "Well, you know, I got an idea for an exhibition, and I just wanted to run it by you just to see what you thought." And he had just been paroled under amazingly strict parole conditions, and in hindsight, I don't really think I appreciated that. But Lex was all for it, you know, and I just said, you know, I want to do a drawing. I want to have, this is what the exhibition will look like, and we're going to do some video. And I didn't want to tell him too much, and I think I didn't want to tell him too much because I didn't want to get him into trouble. I didn't want him talking about anything that would get him locked up. And in hindsight, I think. In hindsight, we probably jumped the gun. I don't know. Nothing came of it. I thought the police were going to shut us down, and when they didn't, I just thought, oh yeah, okay, all right. I wonder if they'll shut us down next week or something. But but Lex just said, you know, I think that's okay, and because I said to him, you know, I don't want to do anything that's going to get you locked up or anything. He goes, no, I think it'll be all right. And so I went and did it. But I probably should have waited until his parole conditions were up.
So it was risky. It would have been another couple of years.
Well, the problem is that, you know, if the shit was going to hit the fan, I wasn't going to get locked up. And so that kind of, thank goodness, it's okay. And you know.
Well, and now that work is in the collection of, you know, major institutions.
It's had a good run. Yeah.
It was on display at the MCA for a couple of years, I'm sure.
Yeah. I think they squeezed it dry.
Major work. Mm-hmm.
No, but it's always been a fairly respectful kind of show whenever places have put it on. I think people appreciate the content, and
it's a hard work to sit through, to watch.
Oh, yeah, I mean, when I first made it, I didn't watch it very often. I still don't, actually. I watch it every now and then, but I don't really watch it all the way through. It's only when I think of something in it, and I'll go back through it and watch it again. But there's nothing easy or light about it, I think. But then again, if you get the opportunity to watch it, there's actually no violence in it. There's only a little bit of harsh language, and but there's actually no violence in it. The only violence in the film is there's a scene where a fire engine is coming down the street and someone throws a rock at it, and it cracks the windshield of the, and that's literally the only violence in the whole thing.
Mm.
And we trawled through about more than 30 hours of footage, and that's the best stuff that's in the film. So because of that, the Queensland government sent in the riot troops and crushed them like a community had never been crushed before, and paid for it. So, yeah.
And this Palm Island as a place is a very interesting motif in your work and kind of repeats. In 2018, you make The Island, which is a work that, a 3-channel video work, which is quite a shift for you, but still it ruminates and thinks about islands and islands as prisons, as Palm Island was, as Australia was. And then in the contemporary context of other prison islands such as Christmas Island, Manus Island, etc. Can you talk about also the shift that brought within your work?
Well, I made that, and that I made that as a response to Australia's kind of immigration policy, kind of lurching towards brutality, rushing towards it, really. And shamefully, horribly and shamefully. And even now, I can hardly fathom or reconcile how brutal Australia's immigration policies are towards refugees. And it was very, very clear to me when that everyone was okay with it, and everyone still is. We're sitting here and we're okay with it. We are, because it's happening and we're okay with it. But it occurred to me that this is what happened to blackfellas in the 1800s when local powers first started rounding up blackfellas and arbitrarily confining our people to missions and reserves, and it particularly, and Palm Island is a prime example of that. And Palm Island was designed to be a place of punishment, and it operated like that for a long, long time. Kind of still does. The fact that the police came down so hard in 2004 demonstrates that mentality emphatically, I think. And the fact that there has been so much turmoil on those kind of any places of detention now in regards to refugees is a very clear line that's drawn from the treatment of Aborigines to the way refugees are treated now. It's shameful. It's absolutely shameful. And it's very clear that this country has learned nothing. You know, it's obvious that is the relationship this country has had with Aborigines up until now, and this country, it's very clear to me that is the relationship that this country desires of refugees. Yeah, shameful. Yeah, and so that's why, and it was very obvious to me that you know, that line was clear. You could draw that line down through the decades, and I wanted to be one of the voices that spoke on behalf of refugees, but I also knew that there are stories from within the refugee community that should be heard, and so that's what The Island is about. It actually deals with actual testimony and real accounts of what it's like in those detention centres.
As well as the gaze. Your
Absolutely, yeah. Even though we don't even use it in that but the gaze is it's right behind those channels. Yeah.
And so the island becomes the title of your big survey exhibition at Campbelltown that just closed at the beginning of the pandemic last year.
Yeah.
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 That's a big moment, it's a big survey exhibition that built upon the National Art Schools survey as well in 2017. So in this intervening period from you doing this interview with Daniel, a lot of things have consolidated within your practice.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, actually. It's not just, it's kind of like a lot of... people always say, oh, what are you thinking of next? And I just say, well, I've got about 4 exhibitions just rattling around in my head at any given time. And they have... I'm lucky enough to be in a position where they can have long gestation. And they percolate and solidify and they kind of, they come to the top and then when I'm in a position to do something about them, I can and I'll jump straight into it. But when you have some of these long-term projects come about, it's very satisfying too when you know that there are these kinds of ideas that they're heading somewhere, and then you have another one that heads somewhere else, and then they intersect here and there, and because they all come from the same place, and that kind of came about, they kind of reach fruition in those 2 exhibitions, which were both kind of mid-career reviews. One was at the National Art School, and that was a show that kind of focused primarily on text and drawing and portraiture. And the show at Campbelltown was a video show. Yeah, the show at NAS, we had no video in it, knowing that I was going to have a video show. Didn't know when, but I knew that the next big show would be a video show. And Campbelltown came on board and we jumped into it.
I think that we've only got a couple of minutes left. Sorry, Vernon, but get carried away with the work. But we've got a couple of questions. If you have any questions, very quickly put them into the Menti system. The first one might be a bit quick. Do you think the pandemic has had or will have an effect on your art making?
I think the pandemic is just affects everybody. I think in a funny way it affects artists less because we're used to being by ourselves and working in isolation and locking ourselves away, and we used to be called mad, but we don't anymore. But yeah, I think the pandemic unavoidably is not so much having an effect on my art making, because as I've just explained, a lot of my ideas are long gestation ideas, and they're whole exhibition ideas, and some are one-off works and things that don't have anything to do with wearing masks or anything. But what we're going to see, unfortunately, and we're all going to be subjected to it, and it's not going to be a good thing, is we're all going to be subjected to really bad exhibitions about pandemic. And that's all there is to it.
That was my next idea, Vernon.
That's all there is to it. You're just going to have to all suck it up. It's not going to come from me. Yeah, but a lot of people are going to be producing work about pandemic and how much they've all suffered under it. And it's going to be lots of exhibitions full of masks and everything, and it's going to be so bad. But, Yeah, you'll all laugh now.
Another quick question, what's the fonts in your text works?
Well,
There's only ever one font, isn't there?
The main font I use is Arial. Yeah, which is a universal font. So think Helvetica, but it's just got a couple of little changes in it. Yeah.
Oh, and the next question, people want to see what the text is on your T-shirt.
Still here. Yeah.
Where are you heading in the moment? I think you've answered that, but are you still making drawings? You still drawing?
Yeah, I will say that. I'm always thinking that charcoal is missing from my hand, and I have to get back into it, and the last body of work I did was the shields. So I was drawing in charcoal on them, and I like charcoal. It has a very particular psychology to it. I think that I enjoy, and it's my weapon of choice, really.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Maybe also your therapy of choice?
I think art is my therapy. I very much subscribe to a comment Gordon Hookey made in a forum many years ago. He said that if he didn't have art as an outlet, he would probably be a very angry man. And I just think, wouldn't we all be? I find. I don't know how angry I would be, because I'm angry all the time.
You have every reason to be.
I think all oppressed people are, and I think art is a therapy. There's a wonderful levels of catharsis in the actual making of art. I think in any kind of creative process. So,
Well, perhaps that's a nice moment to leave it on. Vernon, maybe you could all join me in acknowledging and thanking the wonderful Vernon Ah Kee.